There is a ledger in my possession that should not exist. I did not find it. It found me. That is the only honest way I can describe the manner in which this document entered my life. Not through research, not through auction, not through the careful, sterile channels by which historians acquire their artifacts. No, this ledger arrived in a wooden box left on the doorstep of my study, wrapped in sailcloth so old it dissolved at the seams when I unfolded it. There was no return address, no postmark, no letter of provenance or explanation. Only the box, only the cloth, and inside, this. A ledger bound in calfskin so dark it appears almost black, though when held to the light you can see the brown beneath the centuries of grime, the texture of an animal's life still somehow preserved in the grain. The binding is hand-stitched with catgut, thick, uneven loops that suggest the person who assembled this volume did so in haste, perhaps in fear, perhaps in the kind of desperate urgency that only comes when you know the thing you are recording may be the last true account of an event that powerful men intend to erase. The ledger inside are not paper, they are vellum, thin, treated animal skin, and they are stained. Not with ink alone, though there is ink here, a deep iron gall that has oxidized to the color of dried blood. No, these pages carry another stain entirely, a discoloration that seeps from the margins inward, a watermark of something organic, something that when I pressed my nose to the page, and God forgive me, I did, carried the faintest, most impossible scent, brine, copper, and something sweeter beneath it all, something that made my stomach lurch and my hands tremble. The handwriting belongs to a man named Reverend Aldous Crowe, a name you will not find in any published history of the Salem witch trials, a name that has been, by every measurable standard, censored from the record of colonial Massachusetts. I have searched the archives of the Essex County Court. I have combed through the papers of Cotton Mather, the depositions, the warrants, the execution orders. Reverend Aldous Crowe does not appear. He has been made invisible. He has been unmade. And yet his ledger bleeds in my hands. What he recorded, what he witnessed in the autumn of 1692 along a stretch of cursed coastline known then as Gallows Bay, is a story so grim, so visceral, so steeped in a horror that transcends the mere human cruelty of the trials, that I understand now why it was buried. I understand why every copy was hunted down and burned. I understand why the very name of the bay was changed, why the rocks were dynamited in 1843, why the fishing families who once lived along its shore scattered to the winds and never spoke of what they saw. But the ledger survived. One copy, this copy, and tonight I will read it to you. Welcome to silent Vendetta, where shadows speak and secrets unfold. I am going to tell you the story of the red fog of Gallows Bay, and I must warn you, not with the performative caution of entertainment, but with the genuine weight of a man who has not slept well since opening this ledger. What you are about to hear is not the Salem you were taught in school. This is not a story of mass hysteria and innocent women hanged by fearful Puritans. That story is true, yes, but it is the surface. It is the version permitted to survive. Beneath it lies something far older, far darker, something that the magistrates and ministers of Salem did not create, but awakened, something that came in with the tide on a night in October, wrapped in a fog the color of arterial blood, and left behind a wound in the earth that has never fully healed. This is that story, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. To understand what happened at Gallows Bay, you must first understand the landscape, not as it exists today, sanitized and tourist-friendly, but as it was in the autumn of 1692. You must strip away the pavement and the gift shops and the kitschy witch museums. You must peel back 3 centuries of comfortable distance and place yourself bodily in the world that Reverend Aldous Crowe inhabited. Salem in that era was not one town, but 2. There was Salem town, the port, the commerce, the wharves stacked with barrels of cod and timber bound for England. And there was Salem village, the farms, the fields, the isolation. The village sat several miles inland from the coast, connected to the town by dirt roads that turned to rivers of mud each autumn, roads flanked by forests so dense that a man could step 10 paces from the path and vanish entirely. The trees in that part of Massachusetts were ancient, white oaks and red maples and eastern hemlocks whose canopies formed a ceiling so complete that even at midday the forest floor existed in a perpetual twilight. The undergrowth was thick with ferns and deadfall, and the air under those trees carried a dampness that never fully dissipated, a chill that settled into the bones and stayed there like a sickness. But Gallows Bay was neither town nor village. It was the margin, the in-between place, a crescent-shaped inlet approximately 2 miles north of Salem town proper, accessible only by a narrow path that wound along the cliffs above the Atlantic. The bay itself was small, perhaps 300 yards across at its widest, and sheltered from the open ocean by a natural breakwater of granite boulders, dark and barnacled, that rose from the water like the vertebrae of some vast submerged creature. The water inside Gallows Bay was unnaturally still, even when the sea beyond raged and churned. Fishermen avoided it. They said the currents were wrong. They said nets cast into Gallows Bay came up tangled with things that should not have been there. Not fish, but roots, hair-like tendrils of black seaweed that pulsed faintly when exposed to air, as though still alive, still reaching. The shore of the bay was not sand, but stone, flat, slate-gray rock that extended from the waterline to the base of the cliffs in a series of natural shelves and terraces. These rocks were perpetually wet, perpetually slick with a film of algae so dark green it appeared black. And above the high tide line, where the rocks gave way to sparse, wind-tortured vegetation, there stood a gallows. Not the famous gallows of Salem, not Gallows Hill where the convicted witches were executed in public view. No, this was a different structure entirely. Older, unofficial, a simple wooden frame, 2 uprights and a crossbeam, erected on the cliff's edge by persons unknown at a date no record captures. It had been there, the fishermen said, longer than anyone could remember, longer than the English settlement. Some whispered it was Dutch. Others said it predated even the Dutch, that it was built by hands that no European had ever shaken. The wood was black with age, hard as iron, and it leaned slightly toward the water, as though the bay were pulling it forward, drawing it inch by inch toward the edge. It was here, at this forsaken margin between land and sea, between the known world and the abyss, that certain prisoners were brought in the darkest hours of the Salem crisis. Not the famous ones, not the names you know. These were the unnamed accused, the vagrants, the foreigners, the enslaved, the ones whose absence would not be noticed, whose deaths would not require the theater of a public trial. They were brought to Gallows Bay in the dead of night, in carts with covered wheels to muffle the sound, and they were hung from that ancient frame with their faces turned toward the water. Reverend Aldous Crowe was the man assigned to minister to their souls in those final moments. He was their last voice of God. And what he witnessed, what the bay showed him, broke his faith in ways that no theology could repair. The ledger begins on the 14th of September, 1692. Crowe's handwriting in these early entries is measured, controlled, the script of an agitated man accustomed to the discipline of daily record-keeping. He introduces himself as a minister of 37 years of age, originally of Ipswich, recently reassigned to Salem by order of the colonial governor. His tone is dutiful, obedient. He writes of his faith as a man writes of the sun. It is simply there, fundamental, unquestioned. He describes his first visit to Gallows Bay with the detachment of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary task. A woman was to be executed, her name recorded only as M. Colborne, accused of familiarity with unclean spirits. Crowe rode to the bay with 2 magistrates and 4 militiamen. The cart carrying the prisoner followed behind. It was evening, the light was failing. He writes, "The path to the bay is of such narrowness and disrepair that our horses protested with every step. The trees close upon the trail like the walls of a corridor, and their branches, stripped of leaf by the season's turning, reach across above us in a lattice that admits no sky. I confess I felt a pressure upon my chest as we descended toward the water, a weight not of the body, but of the spirit, as though the very air of this place carried a substance hostile to the living." He describes the execution itself in spare clinical terms. The woman was unhooded. She did not scream. She spoke a single sentence that Crowe records phonetically but cannot identify. Not English, not any language he recognized. The trap was sprung. The rope held. She died within minutes. Her body was cut down and left upon the rocks below the gallows to be claimed by the tide. This, Crowe writes, was the custom at Gallows Bay. The sea took the damned. The earth would have them not. It is in the entry dated the 29th of September that the handwriting changes. The letters grow taller, thinner. The spacing widens, as though Crowe's hand had begun to tremble and he was compensating by slowing the movements of his quill. He writes of a second execution, 3 men this time, accused of performing abominable rites in the woods north of the village. Crowe arrived at the bay at dusk. The sky was overcast. The water was still. And then the fog came. It did not roll in from the sea as fog is wont to do. It rose. From the water of the bay itself it rose, a mist of such color as I have never witnessed in all my years upon this mortal earth. It was red. Not the red of sunset reflected upon vapor, not the red of autumn leaves glimpsed through haze. It was the red of blood, freshly drawn from a wound, a deep, visceral crimson that seemed to carry within it a faint luminescence, as though the fog itself were alive, were lit from within by some infernal source I could neither see nor comprehend. Crowe describes the reaction of the soldiers. One dropped his musket. Another began to pray, not the composed prayer of a Puritan service, but the frantic prayer of a man confronting something his theology had not prepared him for. The magistrates said nothing. They stood perfectly still, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the water. The fog rose until it enveloped the gallows, until it swallowed the rocks, the shore, the base of the cliffs. It stopped at the tree line, as though an invisible boundary prevented it from advancing inland. And within the fog, Crowe heard sounds, voices, not of men nor women nor any creature I could name. They were low, and they were many, and they spoke in a cadence that resembled chanting, a rhythmic, guttural utterance that rose and fell like the breathing of the sea itself. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound did not diminish. It was not entering through his ears, it was entering through his chest, through his ribs, through the very marrow of his bones. He felt it in his teeth. He tasted it, copper, brine, something sweet and rotten beneath. The 3 condemned men were hung in the fog. Crowe could not see the execution. He could only hear it, the creak of the rope, the spasm of boots against wood. And then, as the bodies stilled, a sound he describes as the opening of a door beneath the water, a deep, resonant groan, as though the floor of the bay had shifted, had cracked, had opened like a mouth. The fog lingered until dawn. When it finally receded, the bodies were gone, the ropes hung empty, and the rocks beneath the gallows were covered, not with water, not with algae, but with a film of red residue that Crowe could not identify. He touched it. It was warm. He writes, "I brought my fingers to my nose and knew at once the substance. It was blood. The rocks wept blood. And I understood then that this bay is not a place of justice. It is a place of offering, and something beneath the water has been fed." The entries throughout October of 1692 grow increasingly erratic. Crowe's penmanship deteriorates. Sentences begin and end without completion. Entire paragraphs are scratched out so violently that the quill has torn through the vellum. And in the margins, this is what disturbs me most, in the margins he has drawn small, obsessive sketches rendered in the same iron gall ink, shapes that are not quite human, elongated figures with too many joints, their limbs bent at angles that suggest either ecstasy or agony, perhaps both. Their heads are featureless save for mouths, wide, gaping mouths that stretch from where the chin should be to where the forehead should be. He was losing his mind, or he was seeing something that a sane mind could not contain. On the 7th of October, Crowe records what he calls the Night of the Children. 4 young people, the eldest no more than 15, the youngest perhaps 9, were brought to Gallows Bay. Their crime, according to the warrants, was congress with the devil in the form of a black dog. Crowe protested the execution. He writes that he knelt before the chief magistrate, a man he identifies only as Judge Harron, and begged for mercy. The judge's response chills me even now, centuries removed from the moment. The judge regarded me with eyes that held no malice, no cruelty, no madness, only a terrible absolute certainty. He said to me, "Reverend, you misunderstand the nature of this proceeding. These children are not being punished. They are being returned. The Bay has asked for them by name." Crowe does not describe the execution of the children. The entry for that night is a single line, written in letters so large they consume the entire page. "God has forsaken this shore." The next entry is dated 5 days later. Crowe's tone has shifted from horror to a grim, exhausted resignation. He writes as a man who has accepted that he is witnessing something beyond the scope of human intervention, something that the trials, the hysteria, the accusations are merely the surface manifestation of. The witch hunt, he now believes, is not the cause of Salem's agony. It is the symptom. The true disease lies in the bay, in the water, in whatever ancient and abyssal intelligence has taken up residence beneath those still, dark waves. He begins to investigate. Working in secret, knowing that his inquiries, if discovered, would likely earn him a place on the gallows he is meant to sanctify, Crowe speaks to the oldest residents of the coast. He finds a fisherman named Elias Croft, aged 73, who has lived his entire life within sight of the bay. Croft tells Crowe a story that no written history has preserved. Before the English came, Croft says, the native peoples of the region, the Namkeeg, knew the bay by a name that translates roughly as the mouth that does not close. They did not fish there. They did not swim there. They did not build their homes within sight of its water. Once each year, at the turning of the autumn equinox, they brought offerings to the rocks above the bay. Not human offerings, Croft is careful to note, but animals, carved totems, bundles of herbs burned in specific combinations meant to appease the thing below, to keep it sleeping, to keep its mouth shut. When the English arrived, these rituals stopped. The Namkeeg were driven out, decimated by disease, scattered, and the bay, Croft says, went hungry. It waited, Croft told Crowe. Patient as stone, it waited. But hunger does not sleep forever, Reverend. And when it woke, when it finally opened its mouth again, it did not ask politely. It reached. Crowe presses him. Reached for what? Croft's answer, as recorded in the ledger. For minds. It reaches into the thoughts of men and plants the seeds of accusation. It whispers the names of the innocent into the ears of the fearful. Every accusation made in Salem, every pointing finger, every screaming girl, every confession extracted under the weight of stones is a tongue in the mouth of the bay. The trials are not justice. They are not even madness. They are digestion. The final entries of the ledger span a single night, the 23rd of October, 1692. Crowe writes in a hand so unsteady that several passages require minutes of study to decipher, but the account, once assembled, is devastatingly clear. A storm had been building over Salem for 3 days, not a natural storm. Crowe is emphatic on this point. The clouds were too low, too dark, and they moved in patterns that contradicted the wind. They spiraled, they converged over the bay like water circling a drain. The air carried a charge that made metal sing, and horses refused to move. Dogs throughout the village howled without ceasing, not to the moon, which was hidden, but to the ground beneath their feet. Crowe writes that he pressed his ear to the floorboards of his quarters and heard, faintly but unmistakably, a heartbeat, slow, immense, rising from somewhere far below the foundations of the house. On the evening of the 23rd, Crowe was summoned to Gallows Bay for what he was told would be the largest execution yet. 11 souls, men and women of varying ages, none of whom had received public trials. They were loaded into 3 carts. The procession moved through a darkness so complete that the lanterns carried by the militiamen seemed to illuminate nothing, their light swallowed by the air itself, consumed, devoured by an atmosphere that had become actively hostile to illumination. When they reached the bay, the fog was already there. But it was different this time. Crowe struggles to articulate the difference, crossing out words, rewriting, crossing out again. Finally, he settles on a description that I will read to you exactly as he wrote it. The fog was no longer fog. It had thickened to a substance more akin to liquid than vapor, a suspension of crimson droplets so fine they hung in the air like a mist of blood expelled from the lungs of the dying. To walk through it was to feel it upon the skin, warm and clinging, leaving upon my hands and face a residue that I could not wipe away. It entered my nostrils, it coated my tongue, it tasted of the sea, of rust, of the innermost chambers of the human body, where blood is made and unmade. I was breathing it, I was drinking it. The fog was entering me, and I could feel it moving through my veins like a second heartbeat, foreign and insistent, mapping the interior of my body as a surveyor maps terrain. The 11 prisoners were led to the gallows, but the structure had changed. Crowe describes it with the bewilderment of a man whose capacity for shock has been exhausted, but whose eyes continue to observe. The gallows, that ancient blackened frame, had grown, not in the manner of construction, not with new timber added by human hands. It had grown the way a tree grows. New beams had erupted from the crossbar, extending outward and upward in a branching pattern, each new arm terminating in a noose of rope that appeared to have woven itself from fibers of the wood. There were not 2 nooses or 3, there were dozens. The gallows had become a tree of hanging, a great and terrible organism of wood and rope that swayed gently in the windless air, its branches reaching toward the prisoners as though aware of their presence. Judge Harron stood before this abomination and showed no surprise. He read the death warrants in a voice that Crowe describes as mechanical, emptied of all human resonance, as though the words were being spoken through him rather than by him. The militiamen moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes glassy, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested not discipline, but possession. They placed the nooses around the necks of the condemned with the tenderness of mothers dressing children for church. And then the bay opened. Crowe's account of what followed is the most harrowing passage of writing I have ever encountered in any historical document, in any work of fiction, in any scripture or sacred text. I will read it to you now. I will not paraphrase. I will not soften it. You deserve to hear it as he wrote it, because this is the account that was censored, that was burned, that was erased from every archive and every memory. And something in me, something I cannot explain, believes it was preserved for this exact moment, for you to hear it now. The water of the bay, which had lain still as glass for the entirety of our approach, began to move, not with waves, not with the natural rhythm of the tide. It moved inward. It receded from the shore as though drawn back by an enormous inhalation, exposing the floor of the bay. And God have mercy upon my wretched soul. What I saw on the floor of the bay will accompany me into whatever afterlife awaits a man whose faith has been shattered beyond all repair. The floor of the bay was not stone, it was not sand, it was flesh, a vast undulating expanse of tissue, gray, mottled, pulsing with a slow and terrible vitality that stretched from the exposed shoreline to the limits of my vision. It was covered in structures I can only describe as mouths, not human mouths, not the mouths of any animal I have catalogued in my studies of God's creation, but openings ringed with ridges of darker tissue that contracted and expanded in rhythmic sequence, each one exhaling the red mist that had enveloped us. The fog was its breath. The fog was exhaled from 1,000 mouths embedded in the living floor of the bay. And from the largest of these mouths, a chasm in the center of the bay, perhaps 20 yards across, rimmed with what I can only call teeth, though they were not teeth as any natural philosophy describes, but rather protrusions of bone-white material arranged in spiraling rows that descended into a darkness so absolute it seemed to negate the very concept of light. From this central mouth, something rose. It did not have a form that my mind could hold. I perceived it in fragments, in flashes, the way one perceives lightning, a momentary illumination of something too vast and too terrible to apprehend in its totality. I saw limbs, I saw tendrils, I saw surfaces that reflected the lantern light in patterns that suggested eyes. Hundreds of them, thousands, arranged without symmetry or reason across a body that defied geometry. It rose from the mouth of the bay with the slowness of a sunrise, and as it rose, the chanting, which had been present since the fog first appeared, reached a pitch that I felt not in my ears, but in the architecture of my skull, in the plates of bone that house the brain, that vibrated with such intensity I feared they would separate and spill my thoughts upon the stones. The 11 condemned did not scream. They smiled. Every one of them turned their faces toward the rising thing and smiled with an expression of such profound and transcendent peace that I understood, in a moment of clarity that nearly destroyed me, that they were not victims, they were congregants. They were not being sacrificed, they were being received. The ropes tightened without any hand pulling them. The gallows tree lifted its branches like arms raised in worship, and the 11 were drawn upward, their feet leaving the ground, their bodies rising, not in the convulsive agony of hanging, but in a gentle, almost tender ascension, the ropes serving not as instruments of death, but as umbilical tethers connecting them to the great organism of the tree, which was itself connected through roots I could now see plunging into the rock and descending into the flesh floor of the bay, to the thing that rose from the abyss. They were absorbed. I have no other word. The fog enveloped them, and where their bodies had been, there was only mist, red, warm, and faintly luminous. They became the breath of the bay. They became part of whatever ancient and incomprehensible organism had lain beneath this water since before the Namkeg, since before the forests, since before the ice that once covered this land retreated and exposed the wound in the earth that this bay truly is. Not a geographic feature, but a wound, a suppurating, living wound in the skin of the world. And the thing beneath it, not a creature, but an infection, a contagion of the divine, a god not of heaven or hell, but of the space between, the space where meaning dissolves, and all that remains is hunger, vast and eternal, and patient as the stone it wears as a mask.
Crowe does not describe how he left the bay that night. The entry simply ends with those words, and the next page, the final page of the ledger, contains only a brief postscript, written in a hand so steady it seems to belong to a different person entirely. The calm after the annihilation of self. I have sealed this account with my blood and my name. Let it stand as testimony that the trials of Salem were not the work of frightened men persecuting innocent women. They were the feeding ritual of something that dwells in the wound beneath the bay. The accusations will stop when it has eaten its fill. The fog will recede, the water will go still, and Salem will remember nothing but its own guilt, which is precisely what the thing desires. Guilt is the seasoning, fear is the preparation, and forgetfulness is the digestion. I will not survive this knowledge. I go now to the bay. not to be consumed, I have not been called, and the thing is particular about its congregants, but to see one final time the face of the abyss that has replaced my God. I wish to understand what looked back when Nietzsche's grandchildren peer into the darkness. I wish to know if it smiles. Reverend Aldous Crowe, Salem, October the 24th, in the year of our Lord 1692. If the Lord remains, if the Lord was ever there at all. The Salem witch trials ended in October of 1692. The final executions took place on September 22nd, according to every published history. By October, Governor Phipps had dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The accusations slowed, the fever broke. Salem, we are told, came to its senses. But the ledger of Reverend Aldous Crowe tells a different story. It tells us that the trials did not end because reason prevailed. They ended because the bay was satisfied. The thing beneath the water had fed, and its hunger was, for the moment, sated. The fog receded, the mouths closed, the flesh floor of the bay submerged beneath the returning tide, and the water went still once more, still and dark and impenetrable, keeping its secrets with the patience of geology. What happened to Crowe? I do not know. His name appears nowhere in the historical record. His parish in Ipswich has no documentation of his service. The governor's letters make no mention of his assignment to Salem. He has been, in every institutional sense of the word, erased, censored not by a single hand, but by the collective, unconscious will of a society that could not afford to remember what he recorded. The grim machinery of historical silence has done its work with terrible efficiency. But the ledger survived, and there are other traces if you know where to look. In 1706, a surveyor mapping the coastline north of Salem noted the presence of an inlet he described as unwholesome and recommended it be excluded from official charts. In 1741, a fishing vessel named the Constance disappeared within sight of the shore near the same inlet. 3 of its 5 crew were found 2 days later, walking naked along the road to Ipswich, unable to speak, their mouths filled with a red residue that a local physician identified as blood not of human origin. They never recovered their speech. They were committed to an asylum in Boston, where all 3 died on the same day, at the same hour, without an apparent cause. In 1812, a farmer named Josiah Peel purchased land above the former bay and attempted to build a homestead. His diary, fragments of which survive in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum, records a series of disturbances. Livestock found drained of blood, arranged in geometric patterns on the rocks below the cliff. Sounds rising from the earth at night. Chanting, he writes, in a language older than tongues. His wife developed a condition he describes as speaking in the voice of the water, uttering in her sleep long passages of guttural speech that caused her children to weep and her dog to chew through its own leash and flee into the woods, never to be found. The Peel family abandoned the property in 1814. The house burned the following winter. No cause was determined. In 1843, as I mentioned, the rocks of the former bay were destroyed. A team of engineers, acting on orders from the Massachusetts state government, detonated several hundred pounds of black powder along the shoreline, collapsing the cliffs and burying the inlet beneath thousands of tons of granite rubble. The official reason given was harbor improvement. No harbor was built. No improvement was made. The bay was simply sealed.
entombed beneath rock, as though someone, somewhere in the machinery of governance, understood what lay beneath and determined that the only solution was burial. The site today is unremarkable, a stretch of rocky coastline, no plaque, no marker, no indication that anything of significance ever occurred there. The trees have grown back, dense and dark. The rocks are covered with lichen. The water beyond is the same cold gray Atlantic that has always been there, indifferent to human memory, indifferent to human fear. But I have stood on those rocks. I went there after reading the ledger. I needed to see it, to stand where Crowe stood, to breathe the air he breathed, to determine for myself whether the place still carried any residue of what he described. It was autumn when I visited, late October, the anniversary, and I will tell you this, and you may believe me or not. As I stood on the rocks above the buried bay, the wind stopped. The gulls, which had been wheeling and crying overhead, went silent. The waves, which had been crashing against the shore with their usual indifference, seemed to slow, to hesitate, to pause in a way that water should not pause. And for just a moment, no more than 2 seconds, perhaps 3, I smelled it. Brine, copper, and something sweet. The same scent that rises from the pages of the ledger. The same scent that I cannot wash from my hands, no matter how many times I scrub them, no matter how much soap I use, no matter how hot I run the water. It is in my skin now. It is under my nails. It is in the whorls of my fingerprints, as though the ledger has marked me, has claimed me, has written its story into my flesh, as surely as Crowe wrote it on vellum 3 centuries ago.
I have told you this story as faithfully as I can. I have read to you from a ledger that was meant to be destroyed, that was meant to be forgotten, that carries on its pages the testimony of a man who witnessed something so far beyond the boundaries of human comprehension that it cost him his faith, his identity, and almost certainly his life. And now the story is in you. That is the nature of certain kinds of knowledge. It is not passive. It does not sit politely in the mind, waiting to be recalled or dismissed at the listener's convenience. It is active. It moves. It burrows. It finds the soft places in your certainty, the hairline cracks in the wall you have built between yourself and the abyss, and it presses against them with the patience of water, with the patience of roots, with the patience of a hunger that has been waiting beneath the surface of the world since before your species learned to name its fears. The Red Fog of Gallows Bay, a macabre chapter in the forbidden history of Salem, Massachusetts, a story that was censored not because it was untrue, but because the truth it contained was too dangerous to let survive. Because the thing in the bay is not gone. The rocks they piled upon it are not a seal, they are a blanket. And beneath that blanket, in the dark, in the cold, in the space between the stones where water still seeps and pressure still builds, something breathes, something waits, something listens, and now it knows that you know. Have you ever stood at the edge of the ocean at night? Have you ever looked out at that vast black expanse and felt, not thought, but felt in the primitive, pre-verbal core of your brain where instinct lives, that something was looking back? That the darkness was not empty, but full? That the waves were not random, but rhythmic, deliberate? The slow respiration of something so large it uses the tide as its breath? That feeling, that visceral, bone-deep certainty that you are being observed by something that does not have eyes, that does not need eyes, that perceives you through the very water in your blood and the salt on your skin. That feeling is not imagination. It is not anxiety. It is not the product of an overactive mind consuming too much horror content on the internet at 2 in the morning. It is memory, ancient, genetic, encoded in your DNA by ancestors who stood on a different shore before a different bay and saw the fog rise red from water that should have been still. They survived. They ran. They passed that memory to their children in the form of a fear they could not name, a revulsion towards still water and red mist and the smell of copper and brine that persists to this day, buried beneath layers of civilization and rationality and the comfortable fiction that the world is explicable, that the darkness is empty, that the abyss does not gaze back. It gazes. It has always gazed. And now, tonight, as you sit in whatever room you occupy, your bedroom, your office, your car, wherever you have chosen to receive this story, I want you to do something for me. I want you to be still. I want you to quiet the noise around you. Turn down the lights if they are bright. Close your eyes if you are brave enough. And listen. Not to me. I am finished speaking. Listen to the silence that follows. Listen to the space between your heartbeats. Listen to the blood moving through your veins, that salt water, that ancient ocean you carry inside you. That connection to every body of water on this planet, including a small buried bay on the coast of Massachusetts, where something old and hungry waits beneath the stones. Do you hear it? That rhythm beneath the silence? That pulse that is not quite your own? Welcome to silent Vendetta, where shadows speak and secrets unfold. The question that remains, as it always does, as it has since the first human stood before the first darkness and understood that the darkness was not empty. Will you survive the night, or will you become part of the legend? The darkness calls your name.